Why don't medicines today have labels like the one shown in this picture? Well, it's probably because the pharmaceutical industry today is now well regulated by the government. The government makes sure that claims made by drug companies are valid and that products have limited risks. Now, as we look at some of these pictures, we see examples of unmarked medicine bottles, as well as products making unsubstantiated medical claims. Prior to 1906, there were no regulations on food and drug sales in the United States. So we see this one here, Rubifoam for the teeth, 25 cents a bottle. See this one here for Kingsland's chlorinated tablets, claims it can cure all throat diseases. Here's one for Loring's Fatten You and Corpula Foods. And then, of course, we ask this question. Now, what possible problems might concern consumers because there were no regulations for food and medicines? Well, consumers might worry about contaminated foods and medicines that did not cure illnesses they claimed to cure, and medicines that did not have any health benefits. Now, what instructions and warnings are written on prescription bottles or over-the-counter medications today? Well, if you get medicine from a pharmacy today, you will see dosage instructions. There are warnings related to when and when not to take a medication. There are instructions as to who should be taking the medication and who should not. There are also drug interaction warnings. So why would a producer add an unnecessary chemical to a food or drug? Well, because it can keep costs down by attempting to synthesize the original material or by diluting it. Patent medications were one of the first major products promoted by widespread advertising. Medicines would list exotic ingredients or promise incredible results. Have you ever heard the term snake oil salesman? A snake oil was a commonly listed ingredient in many liniments from this time period. When the truth was learned about these products, the term snake oil salesman took on the meaning of someone who sells a bogus item that doesn't do what it says it will do. Since the reforms of the Progressive Era, the government has assumed an important responsibility in protecting the safety and well-being of its citizens. Think of other ways that the government serves as an overseer of consumer products. Remember, this does not stop simply with what people eat and drink. The government also is responsible for maintaining important regulations of the environment through the Environmental Protection Agency, the economy through the Securities and Exchange Commission, housing, the workplace, and several other aspects of Americans' lives. So now we are going to look at how two presidents of the United States, President Theodore Roosevelt and President William Howard Taft, approached the whole issue of progressive reform. They have been labeled as progressive presidents because in their presidencies they did a number of things to advance progressive reform and ideas. Now, to set the stage for this, we're going to look at 5 different areas of reform. And I'll keep coming back to this throughout this particular video lesson. And you can fill it in your notes and things like that. So let's begin by looking at reforms during Roosevelt's presidency. Let's look first at big business regulation under Roosevelt. Roosevelt accomplished a number of different things. Using the Sherman Antitrust Act, the U.S. government stopped Northern Securities, a railroad company, from creating a monopoly. The Department of Commerce and Labor was created to regulate big business, and the Hepburn Act strengthened the Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC, by allowing it to set railroad rates. Theodore Roosevelt became president at age 42, the youngest person ever to take the office. In international affairs, he believed in social Darwinism, which held that nations were in competition and only the strongest would survive. Domestically, however, he was a committed progressive. He believed that government should balance the needs of competing groups in American society on behalf of the public interest. His reform program soon became known as the Square Deal. Now, Roosevelt thought that trusts and other large business organizations were efficient and part of the reason for the prosperity of the United States. Yet he also felt that the monopoly power of some trusts hurt the public interest. He wanted to ensure that trusts did not abuse their power. His first target was J.P. Morgan's railroad holding company, Northern Securities. The company planned an exchange of stock that would merge existing railroad systems, creating a monopoly on railroad traffic in the Northwest. Farmers and business owners feared that without railroad competition, shipping rates would rise and reduce their profits. In 1902, Roosevelt ordered the Attorney General to sue Northern Securities under the Sherman Antitrust Act. The suit charged Northern Securities with restraint of trade. The suit puzzled J.P. Morgan, who asked what could be done to fix the problem. Unmoved, Roosevelt proceeded with the case, and in 1904, in Northern Securities versus the United States, the Supreme Court ruled that Morgan's firm had violated the Sherman Antitrust Act. Roosevelt was hailed as a trustbuster, and his popularity with the public grew. Here is a political cartoon from that time that shows how this battle between Roosevelt and the trusts occurred. Jay Gould was another well-known railroad speculator who had been involved in many scandals, and at one point he controlled the 4 largest western railroads, including the Union Pacific. James J. Hill was the founder of the Great Northern Railway Company and a partner with J.P. Morgan in Northern Securities. Theodore Roosevelt is shown here standing in the middle of Wall Street carrying a sword labeled Public Service. John D. Rockefeller, who we've seen previously, was the founder of the Standard Oil Company, which controlled most oil production in the United States. J.P. Morgan was another wealthy man who controlled a huge banking and financial empire. He also created the U.S. Steel Corporation and helped finance several railroads. These are the types of men and industries that Roosevelt was trying to attack and take on, because he referred to them as trusts or monopolies and said that they operated to create great wealth for themselves, but that they weren't in the interest of the public. And so he wanted to regulate them. As president, Roosevelt believed that it was his job to keep society operating efficiently by helping settle conflicts between different groups and their interests. In the fall of 1902, he put this belief into practice. He worked to help resolve a coal strike between mine owners and nearly 150,000 members of the United Mine Workers. The UMW wanted increased pay, reduced hours, and union recognition. If the strike had dragged on, the nation would have faced a coal shortage that could have shut down factories and left many homes unheated. Roosevelt urged the United Mine Workers and the mine owners to accept arbitration, a settlement negotiated by an outside party. The union agreed to arbitration. The mine owners refused, however, until Roosevelt threatened to order the army to run the mines. By intervening in the dispute, he took the first step toward establishing the federal government as an honest broker between powerful groups in society. Despite his lawsuit against Northern Securities and his role in the coal strike, Roosevelt believed that most trusts benefited the economy. He held that breaking up the trusts would do more harm than good. Instead, he proposed to create a federal agency to investigate corporations and publicize the findings. Roosevelt believed the most effective way to prevent big business from abusing its power was to keep the public informed. In 1903, Roosevelt convinced Congress to create the Department of Commerce and Labor. The following year, this department began investigating U.S. Steel, a giant holding company that had been created in 1901. Worried about a possible antitrust lawsuit, though, the company's leaders met privately with Roosevelt. They offered to open their files for examination. In exchange, the Department of Commerce and Labor would privately tell the company about any problems and allow them to fix the problems quietly. Roosevelt accepted this gentleman's agreement, as he called it, and soon made similar deals with other companies. These deals gave him the ability to regulate big business without having to sacrifice economic efficiency by breaking up the trusts. In keeping with his belief in regulation, Roosevelt also pushed through the Hepburn Act through Congress in 1906. The act was intended to strengthen the Interstate Commerce Commission, or ICC, by giving it the power to set railroad rates. At first, railroad companies were suspicious of the ICC. However, the railroads eventually realized they could work with the commission to set rates and regulations that limited competition and prevented new competitors from entering the industry. By 1920, the ICC had begun setting rates at levels intended to ensure the industry's profits. By 1905, consumer protection had also become a national issue, and so had workplace safety. Journalists and others reported on questionable and potentially dangerous practices of the manufacturers of patent medicines and the working conditions for children and workers in the workplace. And so, one of the things Roosevelt did was to see that in 1906, laws were passed setting a minimum age for employment and a maximum number of hours children could work. Progressives also pushed for workers' compensation laws that would pay workers who would be injured on the job. Because of something called muckraking, by 1906, citizens had become more aware of the dangers in food and drugs. Roosevelt and Congress ultimately passed the Meat Inspection Act. And this is because it revealed in these inspections that many of these medicines contained unknown ingredients and that manufacturers made unproven health claims. For similar reasons, food preparation businesses came under scrutiny. In 1906, an investigator named Upton Sinclair published a novel that became very well read. It was called The Jungle, and it was based on his close observations of the slaughterhouses of Chicago. He revealed appalling conditions in the meatpacking industry, and as described by Sinclair, this enraged consumers. This is why the government responded by passing the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act on the same day in 1906. It helped businesses by enlarging consumer confidence in their products. And one of the activities that you're doing along with this video is a short reading selection that comes from Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. You may wish to pause the video now and download and complete that activity. Of all of his progressive actions, Roosevelt may be best remembered for his efforts in the area of environmental conservation. Roosevelt realized that the nation's bountiful natural resources were being used up at an alarming rate. He urged Americans to conserve those resources. Roosevelt was an enthusiastic outdoorsman, and he valued the country's minerals, animals, and rugged terrain. He cautioned against unregulated use of public lands and argued that conservation should be the guiding principle in managing the United States' natural resources. In his 1907 annual message to Congress, Roosevelt said, "To waste, to destroy our natural resources, to skin and exhaust the land instead of using it so as to increase its usefulness, will result in undermining in the days of our children the very prosperity which we ought by right to hand down to them, amplified and developed." Roosevelt quickly applied his philosophy in the dry western states, where farmers and city dwellers competed for scarce water. In 1902, Roosevelt supported passage of the Newlands Reclamation Act. This act authorized the use of federal funds from public land sales to pay for irrigation and land development projects. The federal government thus began transforming the West's landscape and economy on a large scale. Roosevelt also backed efforts to save the nation's forests. He supported careful management of the timber resources of the West. He appointed this man here, his close friend, Gifford Pinchot, to head the United States Forest Service established in 1905. As progressives, Roosevelt and Pinchot both believed that trained experts in forestry and resource management should manage the nation's forests. These professional managers would apply the same scientific standards to the landscape that others were applying to managing cities and industry. Roosevelt and Pinchot rejected the laissez-faire argument that the best way to preserve public land was to sell it to lumber companies, who would carefully conserve it because it was their source of profits. With the president's support, Pinchot's department drew up regulations to control lumbering on federal lands. Roosevelt also added more than 100 million acres to protect national forests, and he established 5 new national parks and 51 federal wildlife reservations. Roosevelt was also very supportive of this man, naturalist John Muir. He was the founder of the conservationist club, the Sierra Club, which is still around today. He was a Scottish immigrant who became a naturalist and writer after an industrial accident almost cost him an eye. Devoting himself to the preservation of nature, Muir walked from the Midwest to the Gulf of Mexico. The journal he kept of his journey became the book A 1,000-Mile Walk to the Gulf. His travels took him to the Yosemite Valley in California as well as the Pacific Northwest and Alaska, and led him to become a vocal advocate for land preservation. He strongly supported a federal forest conservation policy that Roosevelt implemented. However, he disagreed with the federal government's plan for sustainable use of wilderness resources. Muir believed the national forests and parks should be protected from industry. The many articles and books Muir wrote influenced public opinion in the support of having national forests untouched by the logging, mining, or other industries. Those works continue to influence naturalists and conservationists even today. President Theodore Roosevelt changed the role of the federal government and the nature of the presidency. He used his power in the White House to present his views, calling it his bully pulpit. Increasingly, Americans began looking to the federal government to solve the nation's economic and social problems. Under Roosevelt, the power of the executive branch of government had dramatically increased. The Interstate Commerce Commission, through the Hepburn Act, could set railroad rates, the Department of Commerce and Labor could monitor business, and the Attorney General could rapidly bring antitrust lawsuits under the Expedition Act. In addition, Roosevelt's concern for the environment and for protection of the wild areas of the United States helped develop a national park system that preceded the establishment of the National Park Service in 1916. Roosevelt believed William Howard Taft, this man here, his Secretary of War, was the ideal person to continue his policies. Taft easily secured the Republican nomination and won the election of 1908. The Democratic candidate, William Jennings Bryan, lost for a third time. Like many progressives, Taft believed high tariffs limited competition, hurt consumers, and protected trusts. Roosevelt had warned him to stay away from the tariff reform because it would divide the Republican Party. Nevertheless, Taft called Congress into special session to lower tariff rates. The tariff debate did indeed divide the Republican Party into two groups: the progressives, who favored tariff reduction, and conservative Republicans who wanted to maintain high tariffs. As negotiations dragged on, Taft's support for tariff reductions waned. Finally, he signed into law the Payne-Aldrich tariff, which hardly cut tariff rates at all, and actually raised them on some goods. Progressives felt outraged by Taft's decision. "I knew the fire had gone out of the progressive movement," recalled Gifford Pinchot after Roosevelt left office. "Its leader was gone, and in his place was a man whose fundamental desire was to keep out of trouble." In 1909, Taft further angered progressives by replacing Roosevelt's Secretary of the Interior, James R. Garfield, with Richard A. Ballinger. Garfield was an aggressive conservationist. Ballinger was a conservative corporate lawyer. Once in office, Ballinger tried to open nearly 1 million acres of public lands to private development. Ballinger expressed his disgust with the excitement for conservation. He said, "Many people have been led to believe that conservation holds the secret of our national well-being. The demagogue, the fanatic, the sentimentalist, the faddist are crusading under the banner of conservation, mainly because it is popular and holds the attention of the hour." He stated that in a New York Times article in August of 1910. Gifford Pinchot accused Ballinger of planning to give valuable public lands in Alaska to a private business group for his own profit. Taft's Attorney General investigated the charges and decided they were unfounded. But not satisfied, Pinchot went to the press and asked Congress to investigate. Taft fired Pinchot for insubordination or disobedience to authority. The congressional investigation cleared Ballinger. This page from the Los Angeles Times, dated January 9, 1910, highlights the controversy between progressive Gifford Pinchot and Taft's Secretary of the Interior, Richard Ballinger. Pinchot leaked a story to the press alleging that Ballinger turned over public lands for personal profit, and it made the headlines. Despite his political problems, Taft also had several successes. Although Roosevelt was nicknamed the Trust Buster, Taft actually brought twice as many antitrust cases in 4 years as his predecessor had in 7. In other areas, Taft also pursued progressive policies. In 1912, he established the Children's Bureau. This agency investigated and publicized the problems of child labor that you see here. Here's a picture of one group of children working at a Georgia cotton mill in 1909. 2 boys keep a spinning machine running by repairing broken thread and replacing bobbins as they are filled. This photograph was taken by a social reformer and photographer named Lewis Hines at the Bib Mill No. 1 in Macon, Georgia. Now, even though many child labor laws were in place at the state and local level, they were often ignored, and this is especially true in rural areas. In mills, mines, and fields, children as young as 6 years old would often work 68 to 72 hours a week. Some children were so small they had to balance on part of the machine to be able to reach the spools. And children worked on machines with many moving parts, such as this spinning machine. So injuries were very common, including losing fingers, toes, and limbs. It was very dangerous work for children to be doing. So the Ballinger-Pinchot controversy aside, Taft was a dedicated conservationist, and his achievements in this area equal or surpass those of Roosevelt. In 1910, Taft set up the Bureau of Mines to monitor the activities of mining companies, expand national forests, and protect water power sites from private development. The Bureau helped make possible many new technologies in the field of mining. After Taft took office in 1909, Roosevelt left the country for a long voyage to Africa and Europe. He did not return to the United States until June 1910. Although disturbed by stories of Taft's betrayal of his progressivism, Roosevelt refused to criticize the president. He soon became impatient. In 1907, while president, Roosevelt had approved the purchase of the Tennessee Coal and Iron Company by U.S. Steel. In October 1911, Taft declared that the deal violated the Sherman Antitrust Act. Roosevelt believed Taft's focus on breaking up trusts was destroying the system of cooperation and regulation that he had set up with big business. In November 1911, Roosevelt publicly criticized Taft for this decision. After Roosevelt broke with Taft, it was only a matter of time before progressives convinced Roosevelt to re-enter politics. In late February 1912, Roosevelt announced he would enter the presidential campaign of 1912 and attempt to replace Taft as the Republican nominee for president. But Taft, as you can see from this chart, did have a legacy of reform. In the area of big business regulation, he focused on breaking up trusts and brought twice as many antitrust cases to court as Roosevelt. Regarding workplace safety, he established the Children's Bureau in 1912. This agency investigated and publicized problems with child labor. With respect to consumer safety, Taft continued with Roosevelt's drug and safety reforms, enforcing meat inspections and drug labeling. On the issue of conservation, Taft named Richard A. Ballinger Secretary of the Interior. Of course, he was criticized for being a conservative corporate lawyer, and he did strongly oppose progressive ideals. In terms of economic reform, Taft supported tariff reductions, but his position changed during negotiations. As we saw earlier, he signed the Payne-Aldrich tariff into law, which only slightly cut most tariffs and actually raised tariffs on such goods. So, why do you think Roosevelt's support for Taft changed so drastically? Well, Roosevelt probably expected Taft to continue his policies and the procedures that he had established in his presidency. When Taft took different approaches, Roosevelt's support disappeared and he actively opposed Taft's policies. But both of these men, Roosevelt and Taft, had major accomplishments that continued the legacy of progressive reform.